Good afternoon, and welcome to the ENS webinar on the 2025 budget. This was originally scheduled to take place on the 19th of February and was then postponed. So what we've had today is budget 2.0, 2.0, or maybe take two in the circumstances. I think what is significant about it is, and probably as a result of the government of national unity, we've had a better budget than we would have had had it in fact taken place on the 19th of February. What we would have been sitting with at that point in time would have been a VAT rate increase of 2%. We'll get into some of the detail, but now we have a 0.5% increase this year. If any ERP systems can deal with a 0.5% VAT increase or deal with a 15.5% VAT increase, and another 0.5% in a year's time to take us to 16% in the circumstances. It's been an interesting day certainly from an economic perspective, in the sense that you can see that some of the calculations, some of what has been written has been rushed, simply because of the short time frame. I think from a tax perspective, and my colleagues will talk to this, it's the first time that we've had 3 weeks to consider the detail of the tax policy changes that are there. So from our perspective, it hasn't been such a rush. We're very pleased that you could join us this afternoon to give you our interpretation of the budget and sort of what we think the next steps are as far as that's concerned. Let me introduce the panel that will be joining me this afternoon. So we have Iraj Abedian, who's Chairman and CEO of Pan-African Investment and Research Services. They're an economic and research firm. We're very pleased to have you with us again this afternoon, Iraj. I'm also joined by Ntabeleng Sekabate, who is an executive in our Johannesburg office with a corporate tax partner with a special interest in the mining field. Also in Johannesburg, we have Mansour Parker, who is also an executive in corporate tax with a particular interest in carbon and energy taxes, and they're quite significant changes as far as that's concerned. And the other person on the panel is Jenny Klein. Jenny is a specialist in employees tax and individual tax, both local and international, and will give her interpretation, her view in what the announcements are as far as that's concerned. I just want to take just sort of explain the process as I understand it, what could happen. I think that 3 weeks ago it was delayed simply because of the announcements that were made at the very last minute, and the political parties that were part of the GNU were not prepared to accept it. Now, today, they did in fact go through the process. The budget was ready in Parliament, but it will now be subject to debate in Parliament and has to be approved by a majority of 51%. I see that there are some political parties that said they would not support any tax rate increases and may vote against it. I think what is relevant, though, that one needs to take into account is the tax acts. The various tax acts do in fact make provision for this. So the Income Tax Act, the VAT Act, and the Excise Act says that the minister in his budget can make an announcement on changes to rates specifically from a date that is determined, that is announced in the budget, but they have to be approved within Parliament within a 12-month period. The law says subject to the approval within a 5-month, within a 12-month period. What is interesting is the explanatory memorandum that was issued at that point in time, and this is not exactly in the law, says that if it's not approved within that 12-month period, then it goes back to the old rate. So it's not so effectively from a VAT perspective, we would have had a VAT rate of 15.5%. If they cannot achieve consensus or get a majority in Parliament, then it reverts back to 15%, sort of 12 months after date of implementation, and that would apply sort of across the board for excise rates increase as well. It also means that in terms of the Public Finance Management Act, the government doesn't come to a standstill in the circumstances. It does allow for them to spend within the first 4 months 45% of the prior year's budget that has been approved, and then 10% sort of a month after that while that debate is happening. So we could be in for some interesting debates in Parliament in the next few weeks. Obviously the new fiscal year starts on the 1st of April, and as far as possible that debate should be finalized before then. I would like to just start by asking everybody sort of what their impressions were within their own particular area of expertise. And I wonder, Iraj, if we could start with you. The minister stood up and kind of interestingly enough used about 200 more words than he has used in his previous two budget speech, so just over 5,000. But if you look at the detail, if you sort of analyze the documents that have been available, there's in fact quite a lot of stuff that he should have said that it sounds like he didn't say in the circumstances. What do you think of this afternoon's budget, and are we on the right track?
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. Good to be with you. I think this budget obviously is at one level, it's a compromise budget. The minister and the ANC, particularly within the cabinet, had to compromise to come down from a 2% non-negotiable VAT rate to a 0.5% now. And my hope is that in the next 6 weeks that we have until the end of April, where the budgetary committees of the Parliament engage with the details, they will be able to hammer more changes, and that would be a very good sign for our constitutional democracy, but also for our fiscal management and what is, in language of economists, in the jargon of fiscal policy, is called allocative efficiency of the national budget. In that context, a lot of important details were left out. Possibly the elephant in the room is that this budget, despite the minister's claim that this is a growth-friendly budget, it offers nothing new, nothing that we didn't know last year or 5 years ago about drivers of economic growth. Allocating money to infrastructure doesn't necessarily and automatically translate to growth, as we have seen since 2009. Hundreds of billions have been allocated to various projects, from Kusile to Medupi to water schemes, you name it. There's no shortage of allocation. And at the same time, growth has gone from 5% in 2021 to this past year of 0.6%. Although the budget documents suggest that it's 0.8, but we can forgive them for not updating those numbers. But when the growth is at 0.6, the first and foremost duty of any Minister of Finance and any budget speech is to come up to the nation and say how we're going to turn that particular fault line or shortcomings of our economy. Remember, in growth is not an economic issue, it's also a fiscal issue immediately. You don't grow, you don't have tax revenue. So it is in the purview of the Minister of Finance to immediately zoom on that. As, by the way, Minister Mbuveni 7 years ago on the same kind of platform said, unless we get the growth revived and restored, we're going to have a growing fiscal problem, exactly as he predicted, exactly as today I can predict, or you can predict, that if this economy does not grow, we're going to have next year, this time, more of a fiscal challenge, and the year after, we're going to have a real crisis of massive proportion, much bigger than what we have. Kicking the can down the road is not the way to solve fiscal problems. And this is what this budget does. This budget speech kicks the can again down. And there are a couple of nuggets in there. The expenditure, the minister acknowledges, as the president has acknowledged, as every citizen knows, that government inefficiency is just gone beyond any acceptable level. The minister says over the past 11 years, government has done 240 expenditure review, and they have taken no action on any of them. To me, that's an acknowledgement of guilt that in any court you would be condemned. This is the level of mismanagement of expenditure of that order of magnitude within the cabinet. So now the minister says, okay, we'll take it to the cabinet now. We'll consolidate all these 240 reports and submit it to the parliament. For what? If the minister knows and acknowledges that there is inefficiency, clearly and surely it should be possible to extract 50 billion or 30 billion rand savings that it exists. So in my assessment, Charles, of this budget is that this is another budget in the continuation of kick the can down the road, hope for the best. This economy grew last year 0.6%, just over 0.5%. And the minister's projection is that next year it will grow at 1.9%. Now it increased by 300% plus, without introducing any new measure, and with introducing, if it passed by the parliament, 0.5% VAT increase, which at the end will be counterproductive. So in that sense, this budget does not deal with the real issues. Thank you very much. And you're mute.
Apologies. One of the things that we keep on talking about within this, in terms of kicking the can down the road, is should we have an austerity budget and have less teachers and doctors in the circumstances? That's not what you're talking about at all. What you are saying is that there are significant other savings. I mean, the new numbers, the VAT rate, the sort of fiscal drag adjustment that hasn't been done generates about 30 billion rand. Now on a 1.9 trillion rand, that's really a small percentage, and it was in fact possible to have achieved that without necessarily increasing tax rates. And if we did increase tax rate, then what they should have done, as we have increased tax rate, that should have gone into spend that could create jobs, that could get the economic growth going, and that's what's missing in these circumstances.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm not suggesting that austerity measure, but I'm suggesting strongly that there's an absolute desperate need for expenditure reallocation from the top heavy to the service delivery, and at times sheer cutting. There's an awful lot that if we have time, we can come back to.
Thank you, Iraj. Mansoor, I mean, they have, on the carbon taxes side, on the energy taxes side, I mean, there have been sort of quite big announcements. This is not really new, because there was a decision, a discussion paper in November last year. Is there a shock? What is your sense of these changes? Is this going to add significant costs to people and reduce profits on their bottom line?
And it's correct. In November last year, National Treasury issued a discussion paper setting out a range of proposals with regard to the next phase of carbon tax. Bearing in mind that carbon tax is introduced in phases, and the current phase of carbon tax, the first phase, comes to an end 31 December of this year. The new phase kicks off from next year. So we were always expecting a consultation process leading on to phase 2. And that consultation process kicked off with a November 2024 discussion paper that had proposals that's been softened in the current budget proposals. There were various submissions made. Treasury released the presentations taking into account all those submissions. And my initial impression was that they listened to the submissions, and some of the submissions were very logically made submissions, in that the tax is dependent on various other regulatory regimes being in place. So that before adjusting, removing allowances or reducing allowances, you've got to be sure that the totality of the regulatory regime is in place. And we see that theme coming through in the way those proposals have been softened this time around. On the energy side, there was a proposal to increase the thresholds, which has now been abandoned. So that's not so good for the energy sector. But there is another proposal which appeared in last year's budget review and has appeared this year again, for the concept of a flow-through share, which is used in the energy sector as well as the mining sector, where Ntebeleng practices mainly in. And that has appeared again, and a consultation paper will be published this year on that concept. So it's been somewhat of a mixed bag. On the energy side, we didn't quite get what we want in terms of the thresholds for renewable energy projects to benefit of the 1-year write-off period to be increased. But we do have this concept of a flow-through share, for which a consultation paper might be issued. And on the carbon tax side, the proposals are softer than what was contained in the discussion paper of last year. Thank you.
Thank you, man. So in Ntebeleng, from a corporate tax perspective, obviously the global minimum tax bill is now in force, and they seem to be predicting a slight increase in terms of tax collections from corporate tax, which presumably means profits are going to increase. Was there anything else that was really significant in terms of today's announcements?
I don't think so, Charles. I don't think we were expecting to see anything significant. And just based on what we saw on the 19th of February from the document that was circulated then, you'll remember that in 2023, quite significant changes were made from a corporate income tax perspective. Pre-2023, taxpayers were entitled to bring forward their prior year losses and set them off against their taxable income until they had exhausted those prior year losses. And that was a limitation was placed on that. And you can only utilize your balance of assessed losses, so your losses brought forward from prior years, up to 80% of your income, or $1 million, whichever is the greater. So that ensures that then taxpayers would pay tax on at least 20% of their income. And the point of that was to smooth corporate income tax revenues, while also allowing the government the fiscal space to reduce the corporate income tax rate to 27%. Now, there was a lot of furor about these amendments when they came in, and there was lots of submissions made. And I think we sort of landed at this place. And the idea was that the intention of National Treasury is to actually reduce corporate income tax rates, over time. So it would have been very strange to see an about turn today in the budget speech where there was an increase in the corporate income tax rate. So I don't think we expected to see anything like that. On the global minimum tax, yes. So government is estimating that they will see revenues in the billions from that. Whether that will materialize, we'll have to wait and see. The one question is, are there enough South African multinationals, first of all, and foreign multinationals operating in South Africa that have income exceeding the 750 million euro mark to fall within that legislation where we can start applying that global minimum tax to them? But that is to be seen.
Thanks, Ntebeleng. Jenny, I mean, from an individual tax perspective, I mean, this is kind of the second year that we haven't had a fiscal drag adjustment. I mean, last year the cost was 16 billion. I think this year it's another 16 billion. So, that's a significant amount of additional tax that they're doing by not making any adjustments as far as that's concerned. And it's almost as if, sort of a number of the thresholds, and, this is kind of a problem always, is they take too long to do that. But I mean, kind of as a result of the equivalent of fiscal drag or bracket creep in the circumstances, this has quite a significant impact of sort of people's take-home package at the end of the day.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, the issue with bracket creep is that, when you get an inflationary increase in your earnings, you're effectively paying a higher amount of tax. And even in prior years, as you say, last year, there was no adjustment to the personal income tax brackets or to the tax rebates. And there was also no increase in the medical tax credits. But even in prior years, any adjustment for inflation was only a partial adjustment. So for many years now, individual taxpayers have been effectively not fully compensated for inflationary, the effect of inflation. So this is the second year in a row that there is no change. And in fact, the revenue to be raised as a result of this is in the order of 19.5 billion rand, which is actually more than the 16 billion that was raised in last year's budget. So I think there's very clearly no relief for individual taxpayers, and they will bear quite a large proportion of the tax that is to be raised as a result of this budget. I think the only aspect where there was some relief for inflation is the transfer duty table, the thresholds for transfer duty. Those will be adjusted upwards by 10%. So there's some relief there, but obviously that's only of application in limited circumstances where property is being acquired. So overall, I think individual taxpayers, unlike the previous version of the budget on the 19th of February, are bearing considerably more of the tax burden than they were anticipating to do under that original budget proposal.
Thanks, Jenny. And then, I mean, from a VAT perspective, I mean, what we have seen is, I mean, the increase of rate was in effect, by 0.5%, from the 1st of May. Now, if we look, the last VAT rate increase was in 2018. That was announced in February, came into effect on the 1st of April. So the implementation time was reasonably the same as far as that's concerned. I mean, the other announcement around that, and this is sort of an attempt to to help poorer households in the circumstances. There have been some additional zero ratings that have been announced. So I mean, one of our biggest concerns always is the fact that there's never really been a meat product on this list. So we have had a meat product now introduced. It's across all animals. I mean, we were hoping that poultry or chicken specifically would be included on that list, but effectively what they've done is they've included offal and some specific cuts that are included as well. I mean, dairy liquid blends that we also did the submission to National Treasury on has also been included, and then I mean, canned vegetables as well at a cost of about 2 billion rand. So I mean, I think there's a technical issue in terms of the implementation of that. The effective date of that is also the 1st of May. That means that there needs to be legislation passed before that date, and there need to be very careful definitions drafted as far as that's concerned. If you go back to 2018, what you saw at that point in time was that the additional zero ratings, and there were sort of 2 on the foodstuffs and 1 on the health side, only came into effect on the 1st of April 2019. So there was a full year to actually go through the legislative cycle in terms of doing that. Exactly how they're going to achieve that this year, I mean, that remains to be seen. Iraj, I mean, what the other movement that is I mean, that we have seen, I mean, associated with that is, when on the 19th of February, they spoke about 60 billion additional that they needed. That was sort of to fund the public service wage bill that has already been signed, where there's a 3-year deal in place. I mean, and also sort of the SRD, the grant that was made available from 2020. So those were the 2 big items that had to be funded from that amount. I think that what we have seen on the grant side is sort of a slight reduction. So they've trimmed that back slightly in the circumstances, but exactly how they're going to fund that additional amount seems to have just disappeared, or is it lurking somewhere in the detail?
No, I have no doubt that is somewhere in the detail, but the fact that the minister was so big before, about 60 billion, and we have a shortfall, and then suddenly it's quiet. And as Jenny mentioned, maybe 20 billion of it will come from no adjustments to tax bracket or to fiscal drags. Clearly, there is a lot of undisclosed realities, which I put it politely, in these fiscal numbers. We haven't had time to go through all the details, but what doesn't really add up for me is not only this year's so-called the gap between 60 and 60 billion 3 weeks ago and 30 billion today. What about the other 30? Where is it going to come from? Perhaps, and if we look at what the government plans to borrow, will give us an indication. As of last year, we had total government borrowing debt, public debt, 5.6 trillion rand. And it's estimated in terms of the addendum to the budget speech that in the next 3 years, it will go from 5.6 to 6.8. And that was 21.4% rise in public debt. And that is assuming that growth next year will be 1.7 and the following year will be 1.6 and the following will be 0.9. Heaven helps us if those numbers don't pitch up and don't materialize, and the tax which is associated with that doesn't come out. Then the borrowing will be even higher. So there's a lot of undisclosed, critical, national strategic numbers that the minister did not really include in his budget, and that I found very problematic as a budget speech. And you might say, look, it's the job of the parliament and political representatives to dig it out and to hammer it out, but it is also the responsibility of the Minister of Finance to bring to the attention of the nation the challenges that he as a minister or the National Treasury face. So for me, Charles, I'm saying 30 billion is a minor issue in the context of this trillion that the government is planning to put on the balance sheet as a debt of the government.
Iraj, I mean, you said earlier that we sort of, kicking the can down the road as far as that's concerned. If you go back and look at, kind of prior budgets, I mean, we have seen the minister make many more announcements of the critical issues in the budget speech. And I mean, it looks like the borrowings, and that percentage has not been announced, hasn't been included, which is unusual. Normally there's a big deal about excise rates that are changed. I don't think there was anything around that. So I'm not really sure how he got to his 5,243 words in the circumstances, because he seems to have glossed over the top of it to some extent. I mean, do you think that was sort of as a result of the timing? It was something, the speech had to be written within 3 weeks. Would that be the reason for it? And there wasn't, maybe those numbers weren't available when he started writing his speech. And I mean, how do we? I mean, it is important that this is properly debated in Parliament, and that these questions get raised. I mean, do you think there's a realistic prospect of that?
I think if I was going to guess, I think it's because the minister had to share his budget speech with the cabinet, so he chose the least problematic clauses, numbers, highlights that he could at least get the go-ahead. If some of these details were shared, I really have a big doubt that the cabinet could have come to a kind of resolution that okay, go ahead and present it. The budget speech writing is an art and a science, and 3 weeks is more than enough to write it. So time constraints on the phrasing of the budget speech is not the issue. The issue is what details, what key indicators, what piece of information do you pull out and highlight it in the budget speech, and why? And that is where my biggest concern is, that this budget really doesn't deal with the elephant in the room. And in years' time, and I want to also highlight, if I may, at this point, one issue that is missing in this budget speech is the changing global environment. There was no reference whatsoever the fact that the Trump is kicking not the can down the road, kicking the table upside down and saying, let's start again, everything. And it's a big constraints on growth, on our prospects, and on the likely outcome of the South African economy next year. This time, as the minister projects, we'll have a 1.9% growth. With the Trump around and with all the focus that he's putting on South Africa and a whole lot of other countries, it's problematic. And he made no reference to that. And to me, that's another missing element of which I would like to believe is conscious. It's not that they didn't have time to write it. They decided this is too hot, too thorny, too complex for us, and it's too problematic for our projections. Because if he had a phrase like that, he would have said, sorry, I've already published the numbers, but I've got to go and revise them down.
We've, South Africa as a country, has been in this position before, haven't we? Where, I mean, we had to take some really hard decisions to get economic growth, to deal with, to deal with unemployment. I mean, can you compare it to that period? I mean, do you think this can be turned around quickly and easily if we take some of the lessons from that?
Charles, I had the privilege and the honor back in 1996, where South African economy was pretty much in the same kind of configuration, where debt service was 20%, now it's 22%. Growth was close to zero, now it's close to 0.5%. And the challenges that we had then are pretty much comparable with now. Of course, we don't have Mandela, we don't have Mbeki, and we don't have a cabinet that is focused on the national interest. We have a cabinet that is playing politics. But be as it may, it took 3 years from 1996 to 1999 to turn it around with tough decisions. And all of you, as a matter of record, can refer to President Mandela's speech in the parliament in March of 1996, where he said, we have tough decisions to make, give me time, we'll sort it around. And the extent of tough decisions was something like this. We had to cut the budget of Department of Defense by 80%, 80. Just bring some of the tough programs to a standstill, not tinker at the margin. And that's just one example. There were other government departments who were cut by 40%. The programs had to be closed down. Programs had to be rearranged. And by the way, when we cut the Department of Defense by 80% the same year, we managed to equalize the pension payout for the black and white. So there was a lot of tough decisions of that order of magnitude. But despite that, 3 years of tough decision making, then within 3 years, growth went from close to zero and reached 5.8%. So, and we had surpluses. Can we repeat it? I have absolutely no doubt. Will it take without tough decisions? Forget it.
Do you think the GNU is up to it? Obviously, we're going to have this debate in public now because it's in the domain, and that's their job to do. Do you think that it's possible?
I alluded to it at my opening comments that my hope is that the parliament will get real and will open up this particular not can of worms, can of possibilities, bucket of possibilities, with tough choices, but with the turnaround and very bright prospects and outcomes. If they do that, of course, technically we can. Technically, there is in fact, we have better opportunity now in many other areas. We don't have Mandela's political morality. We don't have Mbeki's economic clarity, all of that, yes. But we have other opportunities that we did not have at that time. For example, at that time, South Africa was not rateable. Never mind that we are junk rated. Nobody would lend us because we didn't have an asset liability roster or register. So there's a lot of positive stuff today that we can turn around, but it requires political commitment and really a very, very focused attention to this major, non-avoidable elephant in the room, which is turnaround of the growth and what it takes to get there.
One of the aspects from a tax perspective that has been where there's been some concern in the last year or so is in collective investment schemes, and the position paper that was issued last year and the workshop that happened in January. And I mean, sort of in the detail in chapter 4. I mean, there's a policy statement, and that may be an extra C about that, you know, to say, I mean, sort of a confirmation that the plan is not to start taxing revenue within CISs. I think there was a lot of concern as far as that's concerned. So I mean, that is a positive aspect associated with that, and you know, hopefully that won't have an impact on anybody's investment patterns, or you know, sort of the real impact. There are going to be some technical changes around that, probably around hedge funds and the way that they use CISs, but in principle, you know, sort of the man industry shouldn't be, their tax position should not be significantly impacted by that. Jenny, there were also some other changes sort of in the detail from an employee's tax perspective. Can you talk to some of that detail, please?
Sure, Charles. I think the first point I want to mention is that it was mentioned in the budget review that National Treasury is re-looking at the tax exemption for foreign pensions received by South African residents, which relate to services rendered outside South Africa. So there's a tax exemption for lump sums and pension benefits in those circumstances, and I think that's going to be revisited, and we would likely see changes to that tax exemption. Maybe there'll be a limitation on it, as they did with the foreign earnings exemption, or maybe it will be eliminated. There's no clarity on exactly what it means. I think one of the other points that we made a submission to National Treasury for Annexure C as part of the Annexure C submission process last year. And we see that submission is in the Annexure C that was released today, and that deals with group companies where one company will be allowed to be nominated as the employer for PAYE withholding purposes, as opposed to every entity being required to do that. So that's a welcome change, and it will also apply in the context of share scheme trusts, for example, within a group of companies. So it seems as though amendments will be made to the 4th schedule to the Income Tax Act to allow for the nomination of one company or within a group to actually perform the PAYE compliance function.
The other thing that there was sort of a lot of discussion about, I think one of the, you know, because of the delay, as many articles as you read, there were many opinions that were in terms of how to solve this. I think the consistent message, Iraj, that you've already spoken to is the expenditure side, and you know, it often ended there. But Jenny, I mean, there was often sort of a wealth tax that was muted, that was suggested as a solution to that. You know, they kind of, I mean, a lot of the commentators said, well, the easy way to collect it is additional, you know, is introduce a wealth tax in the circumstances, or introduce sort of a luxury VAT rate above the new 15.5%. But I mean, from a technical perspective, wealth tax, I mean, besides probably not collecting any, you know, significant amount of revenue, the compliance cost associated with that is very high, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right, Charles. I mean, this issue was extensively considered by the Davis Tax Committee in 2018, and they raised a number of issues with regard to the complexities of establishing a net wealth tax. I mean, South Africa has capital transfer taxes, as we all know, but we don't have a net wealth tax. And the issues that are, you know, involved in setting up a tax like this, or how do you determine what assets fall into the tax base? How do you value those assets? And particularly in the case of foreign assets, that can be quite complex. And generally, international experience is that the compliance costs with regard to wealth taxes are very high, and the revenue collection is usually not as high as it's expected to be. And also, countries have found that the redistributive effects that they were looking for with a wealth tax haven't materialized. So, you know, it sounds like that it can work in theory, but actually to design and implement a tax, you've got to make sure that the collection costs, the compliance costs for taxpayers will actually not exceed the revenue generated, because otherwise, you know, there's no real benefit to be gained from a tax of that nature. So I think, you know, it has been mentioned and it has been considered, but I think that, you know, we're perhaps a little bit away from implementing a tax of that nature.
Thanks, Jenny. I mean, talking about collection costs, Mansoor, there's been a lot of, dare I call it, noise between the minister and the commissioner in terms of how, you know, how much more money SARS could get in the circumstances, and, you know, sort of what impact that would have on tax collections. I mean, I think he went as far as to, you know, to say that like he could collect all the tax, far more than the I don't know, 30, 60 billion that they needed in the circumstances. So now I mean, he did get some additional revenue. I mean, do you think that that's going to make a difference? Do you think that there's really significant tax out there that hasn't been collected? I mean, it seems to me that the first time I heard this, you know, SARS can do better was in, you know, sort of 2000s when Pravin Gordhan was commissioner, and, you know, there was low-hanging fruit around. I think that low-hanging fruit has kind of been eroded over time and no longer exists. I mean, what is your sense now in terms of how much of that is collectible? You know, does it make sense that SARS gets more money in the circumstances?
Yeah. Look, it's very hard to estimate the tax gap. It's a discussion that comes up frequently in budgets from year to year. And we saw the position taken after the Feb budget speech, where the commissioner felt that SARS needed more resources to go after this tax gap instead of raising tax rates. So if the idea was that there is this tax gap, in the commissioner's argument makes sense, that one would chase after the tax gap, but it's such a nebulous concept to get one's hands around the where are these pockets of tax that's being avoided, and obviously just efficiency would suggest that you'd want more resources to be allocated to SARS to close that gap. But what we have seen are tinkering on a slightly smaller scales. And, you know, when I began the talk, I said I'd focus on energy and carbon. And if we look at the renewable energy incentive, where we have the permanent renewable energy incentive and the enhanced incentive. The permanent one is a right of period of 3 years, unless you have PV solar of a megawatt or less, and then your right of period is reduced to 1 year. And in last year's budget, it was announced that 1 megawatt threshold would be increased because for private electricity generation, that threshold was lifted, and therefore the amendments of the Income Tax Act would follow. This year it was announced that will not be increased. So when you have the PV solar installations of a megawatt or more, you remain in the 3-year right of period, 50%, 30%, and 20%. So if one looks at this and compare to the tax gap debate, I think we're going to see lots more of these sorts of things happening, where incentive clauses with sunset dates will be allowed to expire. Thresholds for particular incentives won't be increased. I think the interest exemption, 23,000, I don't think that's been adjusted in a very long time. It's just inflation is being allowed to erode the value of that particular incentive. So I think we're going to see a lot of this fiscal creep type of situations coming in, as well as thresholds being retained where they are instead of being adjusted upwards, in order then to collect more tax into the fiscus.
So from a tax perspective, more kicking the can down the road.
I'd agree with Iraj's view on that point. I mean, I thought the point earlier to say that if you're going to use estimating 1.9% growth, and you need a budget that's quite an optimistic projection of 0.6% the previous year. But what I would like to do, Charles, if it's okay, in my introduction, I mentioned the transition from phase 1 to phase 2, and I just touched upon it very lightly. I'd like to make just 2 or 3 points that's relevant for industries, especially those in in high emitting sectors, electricity, oil and gas, iron and steel, but also those who operate in industries such as mining, where they have a big dependence on electricity from the likes of Eskom, where the impact for them is more indirect than others which operate in high emitting sectors where the impact for them is direct. Because one of the proposals in last year's discussion paper was to remove the basic allowance, well not to remove it, but to reduce it quite dramatically by 10 percentage points, and then thereafter by 2.5 percentage points, and then to increase the so-called incentive-based allowances. Those allowances, we have to do some work to get the allowance. Whereas a basic allowance for a carbon taxpayer, 60% was knocked off your emissions, and you paid tax on the balance after deducting other allowances. And it generated quite a lot of debate, because the theory behind the movement was that by reducing the basic allowance, which you don't have to do anything, towards incentive-based allowance, which you do have to work by acquiring carbon offsets and taking other activities, will require taxpayers to do something. But the regulatory environment for all of that to occur was not yet set. We don't have domestic carbon standards at the moment. So to generate offsets is very expensive. There are certain restrictive provisions. The Climate Change Act, the regulations under that act is still to be brought into place. So that basic allowance that would have been reduced quite dramatically will be maintained until 31 December 2030 with no changes to that. It will make the likes of Sasol and other high emitting entities very happy. The carbon offset allowance will be increased gradually. What it will do is it will increase this field for carbon credits, as well as all the other instruments that's coming up in this space. Not simply carbon credits, but renewable energy certificates, and something that's entered the lexicon of late, an energy attribute certificate. Certificates linked to energy sources that's not renewable energy, but where you can trace, it's a sort of cleaner forms of energy, but might not be zero emissions, such as renewable energy. So I think we're going to see a lot of innovation happening in this area. And with the carbon offset allowance being increased, the demand for those offsets by carbon taxpayers will go up. And with the tax rates on carbon taxpaying entities increasing up to 462 Rand from 236 Rand this year up to 462 Rand in 2030, means that the demand for these offsets will increase. So I think this is going to be an area where there's going to be lots of developments happening over the next few years. Thanks, Charles.
Do you think that leads to additional revenue, Mansoor? You got any sense in terms of, sort of what the impact is and on the budget as a whole, or we've got no sense of that yet?
Yeah, look, at the moment, carbon is put into various boxes. Some of the carbon taxes are collected in the form of the carbon fuel levy, others collected in the form of the electricity generation levy, and then some collected in the form of the carbon tax. So it tends to be quite a spread, and therefore it seems quite low when you look at them individually. But electricity generation levy will be done away with, so everything that is collected under that levy will now reflect under carbon tax. There's wealth transfer mechanism in the carbon tax, where carbon tax-paying entities can buy these credits from other entities who are not who operate outside of the borders of carbon taxpayers. That is where an additional source of revenue will be created. And typically, a carbon tax-paying company will pay a rate of about 75 to 80% of what they're paying in carbon taxes. So by 2030, they'll be paying about 400 Rand for a credit. So there should be a proliferation of companies engaging in these carbon credit development projects. And then you're going to have the income tax and the VAT being collected in that way. So I think it will be a steady contributor to the fiscus, but it won't knock the lights out, except if you're in a high emitting industry, and we have relatively few companies who have very big direct exposures to carbon tax.
Thank you, Mansoor. I mean, yesterday there was a webinar that the IMF was involved in, and they sort of raised what I thought were three very interesting points. I mean, one just on SARS, in terms of saying, if global experience is that, if you could throw as much money as you like at your revenue authority, but that doesn't mean that they're going to collect additional taxes. in the circumstances, because there is a sort of you get to a point where additional spend, additional people, additional auditors, doesn't necessarily need to lead to additional tax collection. Iraj, I wonder if you could comment on that, and then the other 2 points that he made, on a go forward basis was, he says that if you're going to have big aspects of additional expenditure, maybe the SRD grant, that has now sort of been extended. It's not a permanent feature yet, but it's getting to be a permanent feature by being extended year on year. And then the NHI. Now, the point that they make is that cannot be funded out of additional tax resources at all. You need new taxes to do that. And I was trying to get Mansour to admit that it was carbon taxes, but it doesn't seem like that that's the number. I mean, did you have a sense in terms of sort of the new taxes and how SARS fits into that?
I think this is really critical to both the society as well as to the fiscal sustainability. The notion that if SARS becomes 10 times more efficient, it will collect 10 times more tax is just nonsensical. Related to that is the issue of what economists talk about, tax morality, and the minister was quite conscious of it. The more governments misspend, mismanage, and misgovern, the more people, both individual and entities, juristic entities, try to find ways and means of avoiding tax, initially legally, and then subsequently evading it by all means. I mean, we do know, for example, that even with VAT of 14%, 15%, we have a lot of service providers who say, "Give me cash, I'll save you the VAT," and it's very common. I'm sure people present here, they've had it in one way or another, and that is the first sign that tax morality is beginning to dilute. And if government does not gain credibility and trust in its spending decision, in its allocation decision, in reporting decision, etc., tax collection efficiency runs out of steam very quickly. So that's one point. The second point is that when government keeps adding expenditure for which it does not have sources of revenue, the minister says 28 million South Africans are beneficiaries of monthly SDRs, and that's a huge proportion of our population, and national health on top of it, and all others on top. Then individuals run out of steam, tax morality decline, and what other taxes are there other than boosting growth? IMF is saying, focus on your growth, focus on new tax revenues, not new types of taxes, new sources of taxes. New sources of taxes, if instead of 8 million, you have 12 million employed, you have 4 million new sources of taxes. And that is, in my view, where our national discourse should really focus on. And there are very few, if any, new sources of new instrument of taxation. Wealth tax, Jenny told us, is not going to generate. So we need to generate new streams of taxes. At the end of the day, too, some would say even none. New enterprises, new jobs, new profit sources that you can generate new taxes from.
And Tebeleng, I mean, there have been a few questions about sort of the global minimum tax and the collections associated with that, and corporate tax collections generally, and where that fits in. And I mean, do you think that's reasonable at the moment? If you link that into the commissioner's view that he can collect 800 million, 800 billion additional taxes in the circumstances, given sort of the current environment, the dispute resolution process, the fact that assessments are often issued maybe sooner than we think is appropriate in the circumstances?
So I think the commissioner, and probably National Treasury to a point, are very focused on non-compliance. So it's not that there aren't the corporate income tax rate isn't high enough, or there aren't enough corporate income tax payers. It's that there's a lot of non-compliance in that space. And we have seen a lot of assessments being issued. And what's of particular interest to me is the Annexure C inclusions this year. There is a big focus, it seems, on some kind of evasion schemes in relation to preference shares and third-party backed shares, and also understatement penalties. So it seems to be that the focus now is collecting from corporate income taxpayers what they should rightly be paying in instances of non-compliance, or if they are taking tax avoidance measures, the focus is now on plugging whatever tax avoidance the Commissioner or National Treasury has identified. We don't have any details about that at the moment. And also a big area of contention between SARS and taxpayers is understatement penalties, because that is also an area of revenue for SARS where, we've seen in the coronation case, in the Thistle SCA judgment recently, the issue of understatement penalties is a big issue. And it is pay now, argue later. So it is an area that SARS is really being, well, in my view, being a bit aggressive on in levying understatement penalties on taxpayers. So I don't think that there is any question about touching the income tax rate. I think that with his new budget and his new resources, the Commissioner will be focused on non-compliance and what he or his team and the people at National Treasury consider to be tax avoidance schemes.
Thank you, Ndebeleng. Jenny, any final comments?
I think the last point, Charles, that I'd like to mention is that it seems that when the two-part retirement system was introduced in September last year, in last year's budget, it was predicted that would raise those savings withdrawal benefits that people were accessing their savings component would raise about 5 billion rand. And it actually turns out, according to the budget review, that the total raised for the current year to the end of February is in the order of 11.6 billion rand. So effectively double what was originally estimated. There have been substantial withdrawals by members from their retirement funds. And National Treasury, the budget review does indicate that they expect that to continue, perhaps not at the same level going forward, but that's an additional source of revenue. I think the last point is essentially that because individual taxpayers have, although the marginal tax rates haven't been increased or won't be increased, the personal income taxpayers are still bearing a significant portion of the current budget's revenue raising, what's revenues that are required to be raised.
Thank you. Mansoor, any concluding comments?
I'm looking forward to reading the consultation paper on the flow-through shares, and particularly the impact it will have on oil and gas and mining and renewable energy. I think that could be a bit of a game changer in those industries.
Iraj, it could be an interesting few weeks with what unfolds in Parliament, and maybe a couple of votes on the budget, whereas previously just kind of gone through without any issues at all. Your concluding remarks?
I think my conclusion is exactly that we're going to look forward to a fairly robust debate in the Parliament. A lot of technical people are going to get involved to offer new alternatives, and the Parliament has got every right to adjust the budget, and it will be the first time that South Africa's budget in a democratic dispensation will be a democratic budget. And directly and indirectly, individuals have the opportunity to propose, and I'm looking forward to that.
Normally, when we get to this point of the presentation, we say the next step is, that we expect the draft legislation on the technical aspects that are in Annexure C, pretty much. So we expect that in June or July, and we'll do an analysis of that and make comments at that point in time. I think this year is completely different as far as that's concerned, and if the process works, we're going to see a lot of debate in Parliament, a lot of difficult difficult questions answered, and maybe some changes which hasn't happened in the last 30 years or so, and maybe 40 years actually. So, I mean, to my panelists, thank you very much for your insights this afternoon and participating in this. I mean, to everybody that joined to listen to our view of what happened this afternoon, we appreciate the fact that that you logged in to listen to us. I mean, I think this debate is ongoing. And I mean, I'm sure there's another discussion to be had in a couple of weeks. So thank you very much, and enjoy your evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.